Hey, everybody. Glad that you're here tonight. We're going to have yet another great late night conversation. So, let's do it.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad that you are here tonight. We are having yet another late night conversation, yet another great live stream. We're going to follow the same format that we always follow, which is that first I give my opening remarks. Oh, let's get the microphone hooked up here. That'll make things better. There we go. Audio should be much better. There we go. So first I give my opening remarks. And while I'm giving my opening remarks, you all are sending your questions that can be sent via Rumble Rants on the Rumble or to Caleb Maupin 22 on Cash App. And then after my opening remarks, we do the roll call where we find out who's watching, who's on the other side of the camera. That's always very interesting. We tend to have a lot of people watching from all over the world and all over the United States. And then I answer your questions for the remainder of the show. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of our show, by all means, send a question. Rumble Rant on Rumble or Caleb Maupin 22 on Cash App. Now, the big announcement that we've got is we are having our convention July 12th, 2025. It's going to be a tremendous event. It will be the biggest event the Center for Political Innovation has ever had. There will be over 400 people there. It's going to be absolutely awesome. So we need you there. So please mark your calendar. Please figure out your travel. It's very close to O'Hare Airport in Chicago. It is the big event of the year. You can register at the link down below. There's a QR code there. It's going to be awesome. It'll be at the Midwest Conference Center, 401 West Lake Street, North Lake, Illinois. We need you there. We need you to sign up and we need you to attend. So sign up, be there. Other news, I'm headed out to Los Angeles for a workshop on May 24th. So if you're in the California, Los Angeles area, sign up for that. It'll be a nice little one-day workshop we're doing out in LA. And a very, very special announcement tonight on this broadcast. I will do something that I have never done on a broadcast before. I will drink a strawberry slushie. That is correct. I recently found out that one of the small stores in my area does offer strawberry slushies. I have never had one of their strawberry slushies. So we'll see how it goes. Cheers. But anyway, so tonight, like I said, we're following the same old formula. Opening remarks, followed by the roll call, and then from there, I answer your questions. So by all means, send questions if you got them. Send them as Rumble Rants on the Rumble or to Caleb Maupin 22 on Cash App. Your questions are always fun and they get this show going in a good direction. So we already got one from Leo Messi. He said, it's not exactly a question, but it shows they can be asked. He said, "Yo, Mop, we going to touch on sorry to bother you." I don't know what that means, but, I'll respond to that in the second half of the show because it's a Rumble Rant. So send any questions that you got. They're always fun and always happy to answer people's questions. So that's the way the second half of the show is, me answering people's questions. So The jury is still out on the strawberry slushy. The jury is still out on that. Hopefully it melts a little bit more as the evening goes on. So tonight I wanted to just talk about a few things that are not, I mean, they're tied into art and culture. And they're not hugely political, but they are political. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about was that part of my political development was that I got very interested in politics at one point, but prior to really getting political, I'd say my family was always pretty political, and but I didn't become very, very interested and obsessed with politics until after 9/11. But prior to 9/11, one thing that I did was I read all of Ian Fleming's novels, not all of them. I read the James Bond novels of Ian Fleming. The reason that I read them is that I was a young man growing up in a small town in Ohio, and my parents were not going to allow me to see the films of James Bond. There was too much sex, too much violence, etc. But my mother, being a librarian, was not going to tell me I couldn't read novels. So I remember I went to the public library and I got a copy of Diamonds Are Forever. And I read Diamonds Are Forever, and I enjoyed it. And so I continued reading them, and I read every James Bond book except for The Living Daylights. I don't believe I ever read The Living Daylights, but I read all of the James Bond novels. I read Live and Let Die. I read You Only Live Twice. I read oh, goodness gracious, A View to Kill. I read A View to Kill, which I believe is like a collection of short stories, if I remember correctly. There's the one that's written from the perspective of the woman, The Spy Who Loved Me, which is written from the woman's perspective. There's, From Russia with Love. And I read all of those as a fifth and sixth grader. I read all of them. And it's kind of funny because my parents, they had no way of knowing this, but they probably should have just let me watch the movies because there was a lot more content that you would not want a younger person to see in the novels. First of all, racial and ethnic slurs. I did not know a lot of these racial and ethnic slurs that I read in the James Bond novels, but Ian Fleming is a racist British Empire, British military guy, and there are racial and ethnic slurs all through those books. I didn't even know, and it was kind of interesting. My family, we didn't even know. I remember in one of the books, it refers to a Jewess, Jewess. We didn't know what that was. We had to get out the dictionary, and I remember asking my family, "What's a Jewess?" And I looked it up, and apparently that is a slur for a female of Jewish descent. No one talked about Jewesses when I grew up, Ian Fleming is very much a white supremacist. He's very much an old British Empire racist, and that comes across in the book. The way he talks about black people, the way he talks about Asians. And the movies are not like that per se. The other thing about Ian Fleming's novels, which it went over my head at the time because I was a kid. I knew that there was sex in the novels. I knew what sex was. But there are a lot of sadomasochistic overtones, which I didn't know anything about that. I was a kid. And so there's a lot of stuff that is very, sadomasochistic, which, was kind of not on my radar screen as a kid. On top of that, the books are quite political. They are quite anti-communist. And it's interesting because the movies are a lot less anti-communist than the books. In the movies, generally the villain is Spectre, this international criminal organization. It's like the Spectre, the International Criminal Organization, is playing the Russians and Americans against each other in order to make a nuclear war. Whereas in most of the novels, the Russians are the villains, the Soviet Union are the villains, the communists are the villains. And I read all of them. It was interesting that I read the Ian Fleming books. When I was in college, I had a friend who she was talking about guy books and girl books, right? And for girl books, she was thinking like Harlequin romance novels, right? And she talked about guy books. The definition of guy books are Ian Fleming and Tom Clancy, right? And Tom Clancy. I never read any Tom Clancy. I have no interest in that. But Tom Clancy and Ian Fleming are kind of like definitive masculine writing, right? I mean, it's James Bond. What's interesting is that that because it's British, James Bond, he is much more the idea of like what a wealthy British person would think a masculine person is. He does things that in American culture, especially like Midwestern American culture, would be considered quite feminine. He's very, very interested in how he dresses. He knows exactly the right kind of wine and alcohol. He's an expert on fine wine and all kinds of things like that, right? And that there is a weirdly classist edge to it, and that he is very, very much concerned about his physical appearance and things like that. I will say that of all the novels, the one that I enjoyed the most was You Only Live Twice. And I actually read that one several times because it spoke to me. It was actually, I felt it was much deeper, than most of them. And that's the one where he goes to Japan. And I actually did enjoy that one quite a bit. And the other thing that I recall about them was that, I don't know, most of the James Bond novels end with a girl on an island. There's a girl and she has been taken by the bad guy, and she's on an island somewhere. And James Bond must go to the island, rescue the girl, and then he flees the island as the island is exploding. That's almost every James Bond novel ends somehow. There's a girl captured by a bad guy on an island. James Bond has to go to the island and rescue the girl, and then the island blows up, if I remember correctly. Not all of them end that way. Not all of them. But that tends to be how they end. Also, generally, James Bond, in order to rescue the girl, has to go through some kind of like obstacle course that involves him enduring a lot of pain. He has to go through a room that's on fire. He has to I don't know. He has to, swim through a pit full of piranhas or something. He has to endure a lot of pain and go through like an obstacle course kind of before he gets to the girl. Then he gets the girl, and then he gets away from the island, and then the island blows up just as he's leaving. That tends to be how they end. And honestly, I mean, they're not the high point of literature, to tell you the truth. Apparently Ian Fleming was a very, very wealthy British guy who during the Second World War wanted to be a spy because he'd read a lot of spy novels and stuff. And he apparently was really, really, really bad at it. I think he lost a bunch of government money by gambling it away at one point. And he was just this rich kid who tried to be a spy for British intelligence during the Second World War and did a horrendous job at it. And then after the Second World War, he started writing novels. What's interesting is apparently, and this is very interesting, the CIA was formed shortly after the Second World War. And according to some of the published works and some of the lectures I found online, Ian Fleming, the CIA, he wrote the novels originally. I think the first one was Casino Royale, which is about gambling, which is something he had experience with. He was apparently quite a gambling addict. And after he started writing them, the CIA kind of saw the Ian Fleming novels as propaganda, right? They saw it as like good PR for the intelligence agencies. And so, like, I believe one of the Dulles brothers, was constantly urging Ian Fleming to write more of the James Bond novels. They arranged for Hollywood to release them, and that these kind of stupid spy movies, which is basically stupid spy novels that were published during the early years of the Cold War. They became a basically an essential part of American, social, I don't know, filmography, propaganda. And yeah, that was something that I did. And what I also remember, and this was interesting, is when I think I was reading The Man with the Golden Gun. And one of my uncles saw me reading that, and he said, "Oh, I read that book when I was your age." And I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "But back then everybody read the same books." And I didn't quite know what he meant. And it took me years of talking to older folks to understand that that is one of the weird aspects of the time that we live in. Nowadays, you go to Amazon, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of different books. And nowadays, everyone has a niche, right? And that's part of, what Peter Coffin talks about with fandom. Everyone has a niche, right? Back then, it wasn't like that. Back then, the TV had 4 channels on it, and everyone pretty much watched the same TV shows. And, there weren't that many books in circulation, so everyone read the same books. And what my uncle was explaining to me was back in the 1960s, the early 1960s, late 1950s, everybody read the Ian Fleming novels because there weren't that many different things to read. And that's, and just like everyone watched The Twilight Zone, everyone watched, The Addams Family, because there wasn't that much on television. There wasn't a wide variety of options when it came to media, when it came to books, when it came to movies, when it came to television. People didn't have options, but people all kind of consumed the same stuff. And that created a kind of a common point of reference where you could have jokes about that because everybody watched the same stuff and they got the jokes, right? And that one aspect of the time that we're living in is that there are so many options nowadays with music, with movies, with television, that we don't have common points of reference like we once did. It used to be we were all reading the same books, we were all watching the same movies, we were all listening to the same music. So as a result, we all were kind of on the same page culturally, and we were all kind of being guided to think a certain way. Obviously, there was diversity of opinion. We were all kind of watching the same shows, though not all of them, and that there was an element of us all kind of being on the same page. That's not the case anymore. Information technology has exploded to the point that there is a lot more options in terms of media consumption. And yeah, I read those James Bond novels, and I look back on that, and I kind of laugh because, again, the racism, the sexual content, that is, a lot of it is, pretty sadomasochistic, the crazy Cold War anti-communist politics, if my parents had just let me watch the movies, I probably wouldn't have. But, for my whole 5th and 6th grade year, I dug deep into Ian Fleming's novels, and I consumed all of them. And I'm the kind of person that when I get into something, I get really into something, right? So when I read those Ian Fleming novels, I read every single one except for Living Daylights. I don't know why. I never read Living Daylights. I don't think I could ever find it, but I read all of them. And I got very, very into them. It's interesting. If you watch the movies now, later on, I did watch some of the movies. I haven't watched all of the movies, to be honest. The movies are amusing. And the early movies, right? The early ones from the early 60s, as I said, they changed the villain from being the Russians to being Spectre. Because there was détente at that point. Khrushchev had come in and given his secret speech, and détente was happening. So rather than have the Soviet Union be the bad guys, it was like nuclear war, and all of humanity being killed was the bad guy. And James Bond and the Russians were working together to stop nuclear war. That was the theme. One thing that I do remember is in the 1970s. They made the movie of Diamonds Are Forever. And that particular movie is interesting because it was one of the last ones that Sean Connery played James Bond in, and at one point he's seen without his shirt on, and he's fat, right? He's got a tummy, right? He's got hair on his chest, and he's fat because he was an old man, and he takes his shirt off, and I guess they didn't have digital editing back then to make him look like a big, strong, sexy man or whatever. He takes his shirt off. He's just an old man with hair on his chest and a pot belly, a beer belly. I remember that being amusing. The other thing that I remember about that movie is that the villains, there's two assassins in the 1970s version of Diamonds Are Forever, the movie version. There's two assassins who are gay. And I think one of them is named Mr. Kidd, and then the other is called Mr. something or other. And it's supposed to be that they're like gay, and that's like an old trope in movies that it used to be, right, before the modern gay rights movement and all of that. Homosexuality was considered to be a very evil thing. And the idea was that if somebody was gay, they just had no morals, they were like a sociopath, right? Because that's just something one should never do. One would never even consider being gay, right? That was kind of the way gay people were portrayed in movies and stuff in like the 50s and 60s, right? Early 70s, right? And that these two guys, they're not feminine, right? And they're not, it's not Will and Grace. They're just two like scary bad guys. And they're kind of like evil. And at one point, I think one of the bad guys says to the other one, he says, she's very beautiful. And the other one says, for a lady. And then they laugh like maniacally. And that's supposed to be like hinting that they're gay. And that's a very like old Hollywood way of portraying things. And the movie Spartacus has that in there as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm going to talk about the movie Spartacus a little bit later because that's a movie I think a lot about, because if you think about the movie Spartacus, it had a very, very important geopolitical role, but I'm not going to get to that now. We're going to keep talking about Ian Fleming and all that. But these two villains that are in Diamonds Are Forever, they're like these creepy guys that are gay, and they're like assassins, right? The other thing is, apparent, if I remember correctly, in the novel version of Diamonds Are Forever, the assassin is a guy who has a fear of flying on airplanes. And that like when he rides an airplane, he has like a name tag with his blood type on it because he's afraid there's going to be a plane crash. And that like, and so it's not that it's two guys that are gay that have this back and forth. Yes, Mr. Kidd. It's not that. It's more, it's just this guy, he's got a name tag that says my blood type is O positive or whatever. If I remember correctly. Yeah, and most of Diamonds Are Forever does take place in the United States. It takes place in like Nevada, Las Vegas, Grand Canyon kind of area. And it's a lot about Las Vegas casinos and organized crime and diamond smuggling and fake diamonds and real diamonds and stuff like that. That's what the novel is about. The movie is a little bit silly. The movie ends up with like nuclear missiles going off and stuff. And that's not in the novel at all, right? There's nothing like that. There are very few of the James Bond novels that are actually close to the movies or anything like them. There was a couple that were close. There was a couple. I remember there was The Spy, From Russia with Love is pretty much exactly the same as the novel, except the villain is the Russians rather than Spectre. But other than that, it's basically the exact same story, same plot. It's like a train going through Eastern Europe and assassinations on the train. And there's a woman with like a shoe with like a poison spike on it that like if she pokes you with her shoe, she'll kill you and whatever. There's that. If I remember correctly, the other thing is that I did see one of the more recent James Bond films. I think it was called Skyfall. And I was very disappointed in it. I really didn't like it. And in particular, one of the things that I thought was very crass and very awful about it was that at the end of the movie, James Bond turns into Batman. And I was just like, are you kidding me? Right. And so they invent a backstory for James Bond where his parents died tragically and then he was raised by his beloved butler. And I'm just like, they turned James Bond into Batman. And I'm just like, that's a crime. And that's why, you know, as somebody who actually read the novels, right? I could read the Ian Fleming ones. I tried to read the later novels that were published, and I couldn't. I'm like, this isn't Ian Fleming. I just couldn't. I guess I'm a James Bond fundamentalist. You know, I just can't handle the revisionism. And so, you know, I watched the early films. I've watched some of the more recent films, and I just, not my cup of tea, especially Skyfall, where they made James Bond into Batman. That was just ridiculous. That was absolutely ridiculous. He's, you know, his parents are murdered, and he's got a giant mansion, and he's raised by his beloved butler. And I'm just like, this is Batman. Like, James Bond is not Batman. This is the stupidest thing ever. I just thought that was particularly horrible and unforgivable, really. I mean, you know, Batman is Batman. James Bond is not Batman. And then I believe one of the more, it wasn't that one, it wasn't Skyfall, it might have been Skyfall, one of the more recent James Bond films, the villain is Julian Assange. The villain is a computer hacker who looks like Julian Assange, has the white hair and everything, and that, you know, that kind of thing is very much, I mean, Hollywood, you know, they talk about Hollywood is a really important part of American imperialism. And you know, Joel Whitney, great. He wrote a book called Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Greatest Writers. And he talks about how American intelligence manipulated Hollywood for, you know, geopolitical ends. That, you know, if you see something in a Hollywood movie, often it's not a mistake. I mean, many people that I know pointed out that in one of the more recent Star Wars films, the villain, the leader of the bad guys, he's not the Emperor, he's not Darth Vader, he's the supreme leader. Well, that's obviously a reference to Iran. You know, and that there are things like that in films that, you know, they want you to think supreme leader equals villain. You know, things like that. And that Hollywood movies often will contract with the Pentagon and negotiate, you know, with the Pentagon in order to you know, get technology and all of that. That there's a whole partnership between the Pentagon, the U.S. military, and the film industry, and that leads to films agreeing to put in subtle messages and somehow. But anyhow, I also wanted to mention, so there are two musicals that I know of that are based on the founding fathers of the United States. There's very few films about the American Revolution, I noticed, right? There's The Patriot, Mel Gibson did, which is, you know, it's a Mel Gibson movie. It's Braveheart, except instead of, you know, being in Scotland in the 1300s, it's in America in the 1770s, and he doesn't die at the end. It's, you know, there's a lot of, it's a Mel Gibson movie, right? There's The Patriot, and there's a couple other American Revolution movies. I guess there's a famous, you know, during the American, the involvement in the First World War, there was a filmmaker who made a patriotic film called The Spirit of 1776, who was imprisoned because he made a film showing the British as the villains. And he thought he was making a patriotic film to support the war, but he was demonizing the British, and so they threw him in jail during World War I. You can look it up. It's really wild. This guy made a silent film during World War I, to promote the war, a patriotic film, The Spirit of 1776, and was thrown in prison for doing it. But there aren't that many films about the American Revolution. I think there was a kind of a kids movie during the 1950s called Johnny Tremaine. That was about, some, apprentice who's like injured and he's part of the American Revolution. But there's not that many movies about the American Revolution. But there are two musicals about the American Revolution. One is called 1776 and the other is Hamilton, which is Hamilton. Holds some records. It was a film. It was a Broadway play. It was almost impossible to get tickets for a long time. Both of them are liberal. Both of them are liberal pieces, which is interesting. You'd think there'd be more conservative films about the American Revolution because, patriotism and love your country and free markets and taxation without representation. You'd think there'd be a lot more Republican conservative movies about the American Revolution. But but there's not. And in fact, the only two musicals about the American Revolution that I'm aware of are quite liberal. 1776. It was kind of a joke when I was in high school. I guess, I forget what it was, but somebody in one of my classes discovered that the musical 1776, the Broadway musical and movie, existed. And it became like a running joke because it was so stupid. I mean, we just saw clips of it. And it's like the founding fathers are singing, and it just looked like the stupidest thing ever. You got the founding fathers in their wigs. Oh, sing about independence. It just looked like the stupidest thing ever. But a couple years ago, I decided to actually just sit down and watch 1776. And I watched it, and I mean, is it stupid? Yeah. It's a musical. It's a 1960s Broadway musical. How would it not be stupid? But it's very political also, and it's against the right wing. It's a pro-civil rights film. You watch it, and it's about writing the Declaration of Independence, right? It's about the Continental Congress is debating the Declaration of Independence. It shows the good guys are John Adams and Thomas Jefferson or whatever. And the bad guys are the slave owners. And the point is that the slave owners are making it very, very difficult for them to do what they want to do. That's basically, what it is that the slaveholders are portrayed as conservatives. And in fact, there's even like a song that the conservatives sing. It's like, always on the right. We're always on the right, and they're portrayed as these evil racists, and they are right wingers. The slave owners are conservatives, right? And the idea is that, America is trying to be a land of freedom, but we have to compromise with these awful people, the slave owners. I mean, it's a liberal film, and that makes sense coming out of, I believe it was the early 60s, late 60s, that the film was made. And the villains are racist Southern slave owner guys. And it's full of like, jokes, right? I mean, just, jokes about, and it was based on a Broadway musical, and there's a lot of like New York City kind of jokes in it. There's, like a line about people in New York City talk very loud and don't listen to other people. And there's a joke about New Jersey. A lot of the American Revolution happened in New Jersey. And there's a joke about something about, in New Jersey, there's drinking and whoring. And I don't know. I mean, you look at it, it is very stupid. I mean, it's a very stupid musical about the founding of the country, but it is also very much Cold War liberalism. It's kind of vague, patriotic Cold War liberalism. Conservatives, McCarthyists, the military-industrial complex hurt America's overall interest. That's the message of the film. It's blowback to McCarthyism, which is really a very common theme. If there was any institution that really kind of hammered home the McCarthyism is bad for American imperialism message, it was Hollywood. And if you watch art and culture from the late 50s, early 60s, it's just so much of it is McCarthyism is bad. McCarthyism and communism are the same thing. They're both authoritarian, and they both go against America's principles. And that's so many movies. The Manchurian Candidate, not Gone with the Wind, Inherit the Wind, right? Inherit the Wind was a Broadway play that was made into a movie. And it was about the Scopes monkey trial. Right. 1924, 27, something like that. There was a high school teacher who was arrested for teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. It was called the Scopes monkey trial. And they made a Broadway play about it. And many people have pointed out that the Broadway play that was made into a movie about this teacher who gets arrested for teaching, evolution rather than creationism, it's actually wildly inaccurate. It has absolutely nothing to do with the politics of what was taking place. It's about McCarthyism, right? The small town teacher he's just a small town guy who's trying to get these students to think and understand biology, but this evil preacher, is going to shut him down. And this mob of, inferior rednecks are going after the small town teacher who's trying to teach kids to think. And that makes a great movie, but that's not what actually happened. And actually, the Scopes Monkey trial, first of all, the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, was a leftist. William Jennings Bryan was a populist who had been a big ally of labor unions, who had, had kind of, been, known as fighting for the working class. And his main argument against evolution was that evolution gave way to social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest, oppressing people, and that World War I and modernity was like an attack on working people. It was, like William Jennings Bryan's arguments against evolution were not, you should follow the Bible and not think. They were much more like Darwinism leads to man's inhumanity to man. It leads to World War I and the horrors that we just witnessed in World War I. It leads to sweatshops and factories and people not being kind to each other. William Jennings Bryan was a populist. The other thing is that the teacher who was arrested for teaching evolution didn't actually teach evolution. And that's a wild story. The guy's name was John Scopes, and he was the football coach of this small town. And apparently he just, they wanted, the whole thing was like staged for media attention. And, John Scopes, the guy, he didn't actually teach biology. And before the trial, he had to actually sit in the car with the kids and read them out of a biology textbook so the kids could actually testify that he did teach them evolution because the guy was not a science teacher. They just picked him to be the guy that would be at the center of the controversy because they wanted him to be famous. And the Scopes Monkey trial was, in a lot of ways, it was just not what's portrayed in that film. That film is about McCarthyism. It's about, the mob of people being assembled by a demagogue preacher to target free-thinking intellectuals. That's what happens in the movie Gone with the Wind. I'm sorry, Inherit the Wind. Gone with the Wind is the Southern, propaganda racist movie. This is Inherit the Wind. And Inherit the Wind is about McCarthyism. It has nothing to do with, very, very, very little to do with the actual Scopes Monkey trial of the 1920s. What's also interesting about Inherit the Wind is that there is a character in the film who is supposed to be the journalist H.L. Mencken. H.L. Mencken was a newspaper columnist from Baltimore. He wrote for the Baltimore Sun, and he was a racist and a classist. And he was just known in America as this well-known voice who was just crass and racist and classist and, like a social Darwinist, a eugenicist. You reach about H.L. Mencken. H.L. Mencken was, just this, I don't know what you want to call him. He was a writer who was an American essayist and a social critic, satirist or whatever, but he was quite rude. He was known to be very rude. And I guess he became famous for writing about the Scopes Monkey trial. And he wrote about it in a very classist way. It was like these ignorant people, these poor people from the Midwest. They're all coal miners and they're stupid and they're proof of evolution because they're inferior. And he wrote about it in a very, very classist and vulgar way and with cynicism and sarcasm. And they do have a character in Inherit the Wind that is supposed to be H.L. Mencken. That's probably the most accurate part of the film, is the cynical news reporter character, the H.L. Mencken character. That's probably the most accurate part of the film, but the rest of it has very little to do with what actually happened at the Scopes Monkey trial. But, if you compare 1776, the Broadway musical about the American Revolution, which is, yes, very stupid, but, looking past the stupid, it's like, okay, it's like vaguely liberal. Hamilton is also pretty liberal, but Hamilton is very different. It shows our culture has very much changed. Everyone talks about how Hamilton is liberal because of the fact that it emphasizes that, rags to riches story. This was, a guy who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, a guy who was anti-racist. Hamilton was anti-racist. It emphasizes, and that the Hamilton musical, right, the way that the casting was done, and it's a hip hop musical and all of that. But I will say that the Hamilton musical is very, very individualist, right? It is very, very much influenced by the individualism of our culture, right? There's the whole thing about he's not going to miss his shot, his one chance to be famous and all of that. It's very, very influenced by the way our media is. I mean, that's what our media nowadays just feeds us constantly. The story of the person who is nobody, and then they become famous, and and I don't know. It's a very individualist story. It's liberal in the sense that it's opposing slavery. It's pointing to flaws that exist. It's done in an interracial way. It's liberal, but it's very individualist, and it's very much, our culture has become very individualist. When I look at the Hamilton musical, that's what I would take from it, is that it may be vaguely liberal in portraying the American Revolution, in the same way 1776 is, but it's also very, very individualist in the way the narrative is presented. It's very much about, going out there in the world and proving yourself. The kind of main character syndrome that flows through our culture nowadays, that makes it very, very hard to get things done in terms of organizations. With everyone being competitive and all of that very much flows through the Hamilton musical. If you watch it, it's very, very much a story of one guy beating the odds. Not really a story about politics, definitely not a story about economics. And I mean, it's, I don't know. That's my thoughts on that. But I always talk about the movie Spartacus, because I like the movie Spartacus now. I did not like the movie Spartacus when I was a kid, because I didn't understand it, right? So when I was a young man, I saw the movie Braveheart. I saw it on television. It was kind of random. I saw Mel Gibson's movie Braveheart. I was very moved by it. A story about martyrdom and sacrifice and, all of that, revolution, right? Freedom. I was very moved by the movie Braveheart. I was very moved by it. So, I got interested in movies about revolutions, movies about revolutionaries and stuff. And then I started reading about Spartacus, the ancient Greek slave revolutionary, right, who led this huge slave uprising in ancient Greece. And I also read about Nat Turner. And I remember I found, this is so wild, a children's book about Nat Turner from the 1970s that was Black nationalist. And I don't know, this book is probably still out there. But there is like a children's book about Nat Turner, the slave revolutionary, that is for Black children. And it basically says like killing someone who is trying to kill you is no more wrong than drinking a glass of water when you are thirsty. And that Nat Turner, it's like a Black nationalist children's book. It's kind of a relic, right? Because this was before woke. I was, a kid in Ohio, but I looked for books on Nat Turner, and they had a few like official history books. And then they also did have this, this children's book from like 1970 or something that was clearly directed at Black children, that was saying that Nat Turner, it was basically emphasizing that because slavery was murderous and because Black people were being killed, Nat Turner was justified in taking up arms. And I remember, I remember reading that, not understanding the political context, but I could tell it was old, right? It wasn't something that had been published in the 80s. It wasn't something that had been published even in the late 70s. It was an old children's book that I had there, but it was, it was saying things that wouldn't have been said in a children's book later, might be said in a children's book now that we're in the era of woke, but it would have been said differently. And that, you look at this, there's this children's book. I wonder if I can find it online. It is very interesting. It is a relic of the Black Power era, this Nat Turner children's book. This Nat Turner children's book that I came across, it was very much a relic of its time. I'm finding Nat Turner children's books that are more recent. But there was one that was published in like the 1970s. It's interesting to look at in the context of history, right? In the context of history. I wish I could find that book, but it's quite an interesting book, the Nat Turner children's book that I came across. The other thing is the actual confessions of Nat Turner are available, and that's an interesting thing as well. And I don't know if the confessions of Nat Turner are true, right? So before Nat Turner was given the death penalty, hanged for leading a slave uprising in Virginia, He sat down with a journalist and he was interviewed about his life and why he did his uprising. And they published that book. This was at the time, at the time slavery still existed. They published this book called The Confessions of Nat Turner. People dispute how much of that was just written to sell books, right? That, Nat Turner had led this slave uprising. All the white people were very terrified of this slave uprising in which a lot of white people were killed. They wanted to write it. There weren't that many books back then. The printing press was a big, expensive thing. And, they wonder how much that book is sensationalized, how much the guy who interviewed Nat Turner just made stuff up to, make it scandalous and all that. And it's certainly a romantic story, right? The story, according to the Confessions, Nat Turner was a slave and he was a slave minister, right? And they did allow the church, so that was like the one place Black people could meet at the time of slavery was in the church. And he was a minister. He was allowed to be the minister to the other slaves. And he fled and he escaped. And while he was trying to flee, to Canada to get his freedom, he was without food and he was like stranded on a mountain. And God appeared to him, the voice of God appeared to him and told him to return to the plantation so he could lead a massive uprising. And he believed he was a prophet, right? I guess, he had studied the Old Testament, even though he was illiterate, right? Because slaves had to be illiterate, but he had studied the Old Testament or been told about the Old Testament, and he believed he was a prophet. And so he had this vision while he was fleeing from slavery. And that inspired him to return to the plantation he had fled from and to spend 2-3 years, I believe, preparing to lead this uprising of Black people. And it was the most successful slave revolt in American history. There were lots of slave revolts throughout American history, and they've done a lot to suppress that. History books have really been purged of that. And that's one thing that many people pointed out about the way U.S. history was taught really until the 1960s and 70s. It was almost standard in the United States to get the Southern version of events of the U.S. Civil War. The movie Gone with the Wind was just, Southern propaganda. The movie, Birth of a Nation is obviously just Southern propaganda. And that, it's kind of like how, the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie is always apologizing for their own revolutions. That's a point that Marxists often make, right? Is that the bourgeoisie is like embarrassed of their own revolutions, and that the Second American Revolution to defeat slavery was a very dramatic event. Slavery was backed by the British Empire. Slavery, had a lot of big money behind it. Wall Street was supporting slavery because Wall Street, at that point, there was no stock exchange. And Wall Street was primarily made from insuring slave-related industries. And that, there's a lot of wealth and power behind slavery. But Abraham Lincoln built a coalition that included slave revolutionaries like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, that included labor unions and the early American Marxist movement. August Willich, Joseph Weydemeyer, and Karl Marx himself wrote for the New York Tribune, which was the newspaper of the Republican Party of New York City, that was edited by a very radical individual who was the founder of the New York Tribune that I've talked about before. What was his name? Is escaping me. Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley, who was very much a rabble rouser and a populist and a Christian socialist in New York. Horace Greeley, and the industrialists. The industrialists and the free soilers. And it was this coalition of basically everybody in American society was being hurt by slavery, most especially the Black people, but the free soilers, the small farmers were being hurt by it. The factory workers were being hurt by it. The industrialists were being hurt by it. Basically, everyone was being hurt by slavery, but slavery was to the benefit of the small group of wealthy plantation owners in the South who their votes were inflated. You have to remember the U.S. Constitution says a slave constitutes 3/5 of a person. So even though the slaves didn't get to vote in the House of Representatives, they were represented, right? And that the slave states had inflated power in the government, and they were backed by the British Empire. The British needed that cheap cotton for their textile mills. They were backed by Wall Street, that was making money from insuring the slave ships that were going across the Atlantic. And, you know, the ultra monopolies of the British Empire and the Wall Street bankers, they were determined to keep the slave system intact. And so Abraham Lincoln had to lead a revolution. Right. And Abraham Lincoln took power. He didn't even want to outlaw slavery. He just wanted to stop its expansion. No more slave states. And he didn't want the rest of the country to have to cooperate with it. No fugitive slave law. Right. There was a law that was passed that if a slave was a slave in a southern state and he got free to a northern state, the northern state was obligated under the fugitive slave law to arrest him and send him back. You know, and that was absolutely ridiculous. And that, you know, slavery was basically demanding that the whole country, you know, bend over backwards to accommodate it. And Abraham Lincoln took power on a platform of, he said he wasn't going to abolish slavery, but that he would not allow new slave states and that they wouldn't cooperate with slavery, no fugitive slave law. And that was enough that the slave owners you know, couldn't stand it. They couldn't stand having, you know, somebody in government that was not going to play ball with them. And they took up arms against him and seceded from the country. And so Abraham Lincoln was forced to build a huge coalition to defeat them. And, you know, there's a poem, right, that was popular, or a song, right? They sang, "Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness," because Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, which at that point was the Wild West. Illinois was the Wild West, and Abraham Lincoln was a small town lawyer who had a reputation of standing up for the little guy, right? He was a populist, right? And Abraham Lincoln, in the speeches that he gave early on, he said that labor is superior to capital. And he said that he said that the capitalists fleece the people, and you know, he was a populist. He wasn't a communist or a socialist. He was a lawyer who had a reputation for standing up for the little guy. That's what Abraham Lincoln was. He was this small town country lawyer who was anti-slavery and had a reputation of standing up for the little guy and was a very effective political organizer. Abraham Lincoln got elected, and they sang "Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness." And one of the verses to that song, "Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness," one of the verses to the song is they say, "Old Jeff Davis tore down the government. Tore down the government, tore down the government. Old Jeff Davis tore down the government." And then the next line is, "So old Abe Lincoln built us up a better one." And that is actually, that is actually very true. In a way, Abraham Lincoln had to kind of completely reinvent the American government in order to defeat the slave owners. And the defeat of slavery was the Second American Revolution. I mean, first of all, the U.S. military was completely reinvented during the Civil War. The way it operated, I mean, they completely had to reinvent the U.S. military to defeat the slaveholders. The reason that the Confederacy was so strong was there were big sections of the military that were loyal to their state and not loyal to the federal government. Nowadays, right, if Ohio wanted to break away, there was no way the governor of Ohio could go to the local army base in Ohio and say, "All right, you guys are with me," right? That wouldn't happen. But that happened back then because the military was very loose, and I think anyone could just get a what do they call it? A congressional what is that called? Where Congress gives you makes you an office, a commission, right? Anyone could get a commission, and then they just set up their own division of the army, right? And that changed. The U.S. Army became much more centralized, and they had to completely reinvent the U.S. military and all of that. But yeah. Following the Civil War, you had the period that they called Reconstruction, where they were redistributing the land to the slaveholders and where former Confederate soldiers were not allowed to vote, right? If you'd been part of the Confederacy, you couldn't vote. And so you had the first black senators and the first black, congressmen and the first black governors because they were the only people who could vote because former Confederates were not allowed to vote and land was being redistributed. That's when public education started being provided. And that, Reconstruction was actually a very, very good period in American history. It's been smeared. W.E.B. Du Bois has a very good book called Black Reconstruction about this. We're taught that Reconstruction was this horrible thing where the South was just punished. That's not true. Reconstruction was actually a very good time, not just for black people, but for poor white people. It was the first time poor white people got public education. And land was redistributed, and poor white people even got some of the land, and things, there was some, progress during Reconstruction, but then there was a compromise, and the U.S. military was withdrawn from the South. And then after that, U.S. history writing the story from the perspective of the South. And, the Gone with the Wind stuff and the Birth of a Nation stuff, that all comes later. And it wasn't really until the 1960s, till the 1950s and 60s, that we started to, acknowledge that there were widespread slave revolts, for example. That history textbooks always made it sound like slavery wasn't so bad, and the black people weren't rising up. And well, they were constant slave revolts, but the biggest slave uprising that ever happened was the slave revolt of Nat Turner, which is fascinating. If you read about it, I guess the point that I was making is when I got interested in Nat Turner, I did read the Confessions of Nat Turner, but I don't know how accurate they are, right? Because, Nat Turner was widely hated in the U.S. South, widely demonized. And there was no audio recording of him telling the reporter, the journalist who compiled the Confessions of Nat Turner. So who knows how much of the Confessions of Nat Turner is legit, right? Is actually what happened, or is just what the journalist wrote in order to sell books. The other thing was that the Jim Crow South, not the Jim Crow South, the slavery South, right? Jim Crow came later. The slavery South was very, very unforgiving of writers. And that's one thing people talk about. If you wrote the wrong thing in the South, you could be killed, right? I mean, that, in southern states, if someone wrote articles for the local newspaper opposing slavery, they would get the death penalty. I mean, they would be killed. I mean, it wasn't for that, but they would find a way to kill the person, right? So if this guy who interviewed Nat Turner had written something that, if he had portrayed Nat Turner in too sympathetic of a light, or if he had written about Nat Turner in a way that offended the slaveocracy of the South, he would have been risking his life. He would have been killed. That book certainly wouldn't have been published. So, even still, though, if you read the Confessions of Nat Turner, it's a very poetic and powerful story of, somebody, having a vision from God and deciding they want to lead, a group of oppressed people to fight for their freedom. I mean, it's a very powerful and spiritual text, even though it's written, in the context of that they had to kind of make him look bad in the writing. It's a very strange story indeed. But anyway, so I got very interested in slave revolts. I got interested, I watched the movie Braveheart, and I was reading about Nat Turner. And so, I read about Spartacus, the slave rebel, who led the slave uprising in 73 BC in ancient Rome. And so I went to the public library and I got the VHS tapes of the classic movie, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Kirk Douglas, of Spartacus. And I watched it and I hated it. I was just like, this is the most boring, stupid. I didn't like it. Because I didn't understand it, right? I was expecting to see Braveheart. I was expecting to see a movie about a tragic hero who leads an uprising, which it kind of is, but it's not. And what I didn't understand was that movie is not about what actually happened in ancient Greece. It is based on a novel that was published right after the Second World War by Howard Fast, who was a member of the Communist Party. And Howard Fast, Howard Fast was an American novelist. He wrote a novel about the overturning of slavery called Freedom Road, which is very good. And then he wrote a novel about Spartacus called Spartacus, which is also very good. And he was a Communist Party member, an American novelist who joined the Communist Party during the Second World War. And he stayed loyal to them during McCarthyism, and he ultimately left after Khrushchev's secret speech. And I have his autobiography somewhere. He wrote a memoir about being in the Communist Party, which is called Being Red, which is actually very good. And I quote it in a lot of my histories of the Communist Party because it's a really, really good book. He quit, obviously, and he's a Zionist. I mean, and he became a Zionist when he quit, basically. I mean, if you read it, he basically decided, based on Khrushchev's secret speech, that the Soviet Union was anti-Semitic, right? If you read it, it's a lot of exciting stuff. It's a really well-written autobiography being read that tells you Howard Fast's story of, being in the Communist Party, enduring McCarthyism and stuff like that. But it also, he's a Zionist. He just became a Zionist. That was his response to Khrushchev's secret speech is, Stalin hated Jews and the problem is Jews are oppressed. We need Israel. He basically becomes a Zionist. But Howard Fast, during McCarthyism, he wrote a novel about Spartacus, the ancient Greek slave rebel. And the movie Spartacus is a movie version of that novel. And what's interesting is that the screenplay for Spartacus was written by another Communist Party member named Dalton Trumbo. And if you watch the movie Spartacus, and if you read Howard Fast's novel Spartacus, it's very clear that they are writing about the Second World War. It is an attempt to explain the Second World War from a Marxist-Leninist Soviet perspective. Basically, that's what it is. The Republic of Rome, right? It's the Roman Republic, is this Roman Republic. And there's a slave uprising in the Republic where the slaves are rising up and fighting for their freedom. So Marcus Crassus becomes the fascist dictator and establishes fascism in ancient Rome, which did not happen, right? The Roman Republic didn't fall until after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. So that's not accurate. But Marcus Crassus, the general who defeated Spartacus, is Hitler, basically. And his capitalism is entering a crisis, and the slaves are rising up and revolting. So fascism comes in. And so then the way that Spartacus is able to, the way his daughter and his child are able to escape is the democratic capitalists who hate Crassus. They, kind of there's like an alliance between them and the slave revolutionaries because they want to defend democracy. And so it's a justification for the Popular Front policies, right? The idea is, ancient Rome is this brutal, oppressive society, but it has some notion of democracy. But then the slaves revolt. And so that gives Marcus Crassus, the military dictator, the excuse to overturn democracy, become the dictator. And so Rome becomes this authoritarian fascist dictatorship. But then the democratic capitalists, who are kind of good-hearted, which it's a little bit weird because they're slave owners, right? And it's a slave uprising. The democratic capitalists help Spartacus and his kid escape because they're being killed by Marcus Crassus also. That's basically, it's a tragic film. And it's a tragic book, but it's about this gladiator Spartacus leading this slave uprising. It's about how, the gladiators, he's a gladiator who's supposed to fight to the death in the Colosseum and such. What's interesting, and I did want to mention this in a similar way to, I mentioned how Diamonds Are Forever, the two assassins are gay, and that's the sign that they're evil. In that movie Spartacus and in the novel, Marcus Crassus, the Roman general who puts down the slave uprising, is gay. And that's portrayed as a sign of how evil he is. And like there's a character who is a slave who is like plays music for the slave master, right? And that's his job, is to recite poetry and play music. He's a really nice slave. And Marcus Crassus is trying to have sex with him. And so he runs away. And there's a whole like scene of that where it's like he's, swimming, Marcus Crassus is like naked swimming in the pool and is like hitting on the slave. And the slave is like, oh my God, this guy's a queer. And he like runs away. He doesn't say that, but that's basically what you're supposed to think. And that, again, that shows that, that was kind of a theme that you see in like 1960s and early 70s movies, is homosexuality is portrayed as like something that a sociopath would do. Right. But that particular trope, and I've talked about this before, the idea that fascism and homosexuality are linked, that is a really big theme in Soviet propaganda from the World War II era and the 1950s and 60s. And that gets really covered up nowadays. That doesn't fit the political narrative. The idea that, that homosexuality and fascism are linked to each other. But that was considered to be kind of common knowledge in America, and especially in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc during those years. For example, the Nazis were infamous for the fact that the leader of the stormtroopers, which was the street fighting wing of the Nazis, Ernst Rem, was gay. Right, the head stormtrooper, the head street fighter for the Nazis, was very openly gay, and they went out of their way to recruit gay men to join the Nazi group. And originally the Nazi Party called for decriminalizing homosexuality, and that there were a lot of young gay guys in Berlin who joined the Nazis. And then after the Nazis were in power, they changed their position, and they argued that homosexuality was genetic. It was a genetic deviation, and they killed gay people for being gay. But originally the Nazi movement had a lot of gay people in it, and it was a particularly pandered to gay men, so much so that there were anti-gay cartoons. The Communist Party gay baited the Nazis, right? And that even though the Communist Party of Germany also called for decriminalizing homosexuality at that time, they did. There was there were cartoons and mockery of the Nazis for that. And there was psychoanalysis was very popular in Marxist circles. And Freudian psychoanalysis was a really big thing. There's a guy named Wilhelm Reich. And I find Wilhelm Reich to be fascinating, but weird. Wilhelm Reich was a German psychoanalyst. I believe he was in Austria and Germany. He was a psychoanalyst. And he was a Marxist. He joined the German Communist Party, and he was an associate of Sigmund Freud. And he wrote a book around the time that Hitler came to power. He wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is the stupidest book that I have ever read. It is the most ridiculous book ever. And the book says that the power of the Nazis is that in German society, sex is suppressed. People suppress their sexual feelings. And so Nazism is all about being turned on. It's sexual innuendo. It says that the Nazi salute looks like an erection, that the swastika looks like two naked bodies having sex, and that it's all about how everything the Nazis do is coded pornography, right? And that all the Germans are sexually turned on, and that German society is just too sexually repressive, that these German people are out of touch with their sexual feelings. And so Hitler gets up and he does his salute, and he, shows you a swastika and gives a really fiery speech, and they're all just turned on, and they can't admit they're turned on, so they become Nazis. It's the stupidest claim I've ever. It's absolutely ridiculous. Sigmund Freud expelled Wilhelm Reich from the German Psychoanalytic Institute for writing it. And the Communist Party of Germany expelled Wilhelm Reich for writing this book. It's absolutely outrageous, but it's still in print, and it's actually highly influential on the post-World War II New Left. The book, The Authoritarian Personality by Theodor Adorno, actually cites it. And I've pointed this out, and I've gotten people that defend Theodor Adorno, this piece of crap book from the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno's Authoritarian Personality. There is an actual citation of Wilhelm Reich in here, and I've pointed this out. It's in the footnotes. They cite Wilhelm Reich as a big influence on them. And I've had people deny that and get really angry. And I take a picture of it with my phone and show them, no, Wilhelm Reich is an influence on Theodor Adorno's, personality theory. And basically the argument is that, in Germany, there just wasn't enough porn, and there just wasn't enough sex everywhere. And so the German people were all, not letting their sex come out, and that made them Nazis. It's ridiculous. What's interesting, though, is that Wilhelm Reich, he was something. So he fled Germany, obviously, right? He's, I believe he was Jewish, and he had written this book, about the Nazis and the mass psychology of fascism, and he'd been a communist. So he fled Germany, and he moved to New York City. And he developed a very big following in New York City as a breakaway from psychoanalysis, right? Psychoanalysis is, it's the Freudian stuff. That was very popular at the time, but he had been kicked out of it, and he had his own version of it. And I believe he taught psychology at New School University. And he had his own group for a while. And it was quite popular. And I mean, you read about Wilhelm Reich. He was, he was just this figure in New York City who was a psychoanalyst who had his own following, and I guess prior to joining the German Communist Party, he had his own group in Germany called Sexpol, which was sexual politics, right? And it was called Sexpol. And they went door to door selling condoms and selling contraceptives and pamphlets about safe sex. And it was this group that you would join, and people went door to door selling condoms. And, it was this group in Germany called Sexpol. And he was the leader of Sexpol, which was this organization that had thousands of members. And then they merged into the German Communist Party, broke with the German Communist Party, fled to New York City. And there were thousands of people in New York City who were part of it. And eventually, he started believing he could talk to space aliens. He made a machine called the Orgone machine, and said that if you had an orgasm inside the machine, it would like capture the magical energy from your orgasm. It was just crazy stuff. And eventually, during McCarthyism, the U.S. government came down very hard on him, and the Food and Drug Administration, cracked down on him and said, "Look, you're engaging in fraud. This stuff you do has no scientific value." And he was imprisoned for engaging in food and drug fraud, basically. He claimed that that this magical machine he was making, would give you power. And he was doing all kinds of stuff that was considered to be medical fraud. He was using the fact that he was a doctor. I mean, he was a medical doctor. He was using that, to give, and that he had worked with Freud and others. And he was engaging in fraud. And also, though, there was a cultural element. Right. McCarthyism was very, very much a social conservative rebellion. Right. I mean, they talk about how the Red Scare was also the Lavender Scare. It was during McCarthyism. They passed a law. No gay person could work for the State Department. Joe McCarthy makes crass anti-gay jokes on the floor of Congress, even though he himself was gay, and that was revealed and all of that. But Wilhelm Reich, he was sexually liberal. I mean, that was basically, his whole group. In Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and then in New York City, he was, an advocate of social liberalism. And that was something that U.S. society didn't particularly care for. It's particularly weird. But yeah, Wilhelm Reich, he's this weird character. But anyway, if you watch the movie Spartacus, right, Marcus Crassus, the villain, is portrayed as a homosexual, and that fits a lot of the stuff. But when the movie Spartacus came out, right, and this is very interesting to me. So, in Hollywood, in the 50s, communists were blacklisted. They were banned from Hollywood, right? They were forbidden. They were outlawed. They were not permitted. But yet, I think it was 1961, Hollywood makes a movie that is about a slave uprising based on a novel written by a communist, and they hire a formerly blacklisted communist screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo, to write the screenplay. And they make this movie, and Stanley Kubrick directs it, and John F. Kennedy crossed the picket line and went to the movie, right? The Catholic Legion of Decency protested the movie in Boston. And John F. Kennedy, who was the president-elect at the time, famously crossed the picket line, the Catholic Legion of Decency. And John F. Kennedy was Roman Catholic. They were protesting the movie as communist propaganda. And they were outside the movie. And John F. Kennedy walked past the Catholic Legion of Decency and went into the movie and gave an interview. And he said, "I think it's a fine picture," and embraced it. What was going on there? Why in the world during the height of the Cold War, did Hollywood make a communist film that's basically an analogy for the Second World War? Well, there's a reason for that, which is Stalin had died and Khrushchev had taken power. Khrushchev had given his secret speech denouncing Stalin, and the U.S. government wanted to negotiate with Khrushchev. And they wanted, Khrushchev's feeling was that if he could hold off the wave of anti-colonial revolutions that were taking place, the USA would ease up the arms race. And the USA basically made the film as a gesture to the Soviet Union. And on top of that, it was a subtle bit of propaganda at the Soviet Union. Why? Because in the Soviet Union, if you wanted to make a movie that was pro-capitalism and against the Soviet Union, that wasn't allowed. But in America, we made a movie by a Marxist, by a communist, etc. And that was the idea, was that it was subtly saying, look, they would never allow this kind of movie in the Soviet. You never would make a movie supporting us in the Soviet Union. But look, here in America, even though we hate communism, we made this movie. And look, the president, JFK, went to see it. It was like a subtle propaganda thing at the Soviet Union. And then the movie itself is emphasizing the alliance between the liberal capitalists against the military, right? Because Marcus Crassus is the military fascist, and it's emphasizing that alliance, right? So it's basically saying that the Kennedy wing of American politics is willing to cooperate with the Soviets against the military-industrial complex. And the film, I mean, it served a diplomatic purpose, right? I mean, it was a message to the Soviet Union. It was a message about the military-industrial complex and fascism. It was to make it clear that McCarthyism was completely repudiated. There are things in the movie that are like weird compromises with McCarthyism. For example, the film ends with mass crucifixion because that's what happened. All the slaves, who participated in Spartacus's uprising were crucified. But they don't crucify them on crosses because the Catholic Legion of Decency took offense. So they're crucified on T's, which is weird. Like there's no it's like a T, right? All the people are crucified on T's. And then the famous scene at the end of the movie is I'm Spartacus, right? And the idea is, that they have all the slaves who they've captured, and they say, all right, we're gonna, if you will help us identify the slave Spartacus, and they say, I'm Spartacus. That's a reference to McCarthyism, right? That's not naming names before the House Un-American Activities Committee. That's basically what it is. And it's about McCarthyism. But it's interesting. So I'm going to transition to talking about another movie, which is it's similar in a way, right? It's a Hollywood movie that's supposed to take place in ancient Europe, and it involves big, strong, burly guys, with swords. There's a movie that came out much later. I believe it came out in the early 80s. And I had never seen it. I had heard about it. You have a blank spot when it comes to history, right? You have a blank spot when it comes to history. And I noticed that, right? When you're a kid, right? You learn about history, the past, right? And there's the events that happen while you're aware, like what's in the news. But like, for me, the 1980s was a giant blank spot in history because I was born in 1987. And so like, I didn't learn about Oliver North and Iran-Contra until I was in college because I didn't live through it. And it was too recent to be history. But there's a movie that came out in 1982 called Conan the Barbarian. I watched Conan the Barbarian a few years ago. I had heard vague references to it. It stars Arnold Schwarzenegger. 1982. Conan the Barbarian is a conservative manifesto. If you watch it, it is very, very much about the Reagan Revolution. And I mean, if you look at, that's really what it is. First of all, Conan, the character, right? He's raised, he's out in the wild. He's there was no frontier in Europe, right? I mean, there was no Wild West in Europe, but somehow it's supposed to be like at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire or something. He's living out in the wild, and he's raised out in the wild, but then, he becomes enslaved. Someone conquers him, but he grows to be very, very strong and breaks free. And then the villain is this guy, is this African-American character, not African-American, this black villain, right? Who's played by, he's played by the guy who did the voice of Darth Vader. What's his name? Right. Who is the guy who did the voice of Darth Vader? James Earl Jones. He's played by James Earl Jones, this guy. And the guy is like a cult leader, right? He's starting a cult that worships snakes, right? James Earl Jones is this black man who is the leader of a cult that worships snakes. And in all the cities, right? This Conan the Barbarian is from the wild, he's from the country, but he goes to the city. And in the cities, all these people are joining a cult that worships snakes. The king of one of these cities is really sad because his daughter has joined the cult that worships snakes. So, so he hires Conan to go rescue his daughter from the cult that worships snakes. It's supposed to be his daughter has become a hippie, right? And it's the new left, right? His daughter ran away and became a hippie, and we need the traditional family back. And the new left is dangerous, and their protests and their drugs and their rock music is dangerous. And the cities are dangerous, and we need, strong, independent, libertarian people in the countryside, settlers, and family values and all that. It's a 1980s manifesto, right? And the snake cult is the new left. It's the hippies. It's the counterculture. Conan is a self-made man from the wild, from the frontier. The king loves his daughter, and the family is being torn apart by the rock and roll music and the drugs and the decadent 60s culture. And the snake cult is, I don't know, it's communism and socialism and hippies and all the bad 60s stuff. And Conan is it is very, very, very much, it is very, very much an anti-new left, anti-1960s left manifesto, if you watch it, right? That's what it is, right? And at one point in the movie, I believe the James Earl Jones character is like ordering the women in his cult to kill themselves, right? And that's a reference, obviously, to Jim Jones and drinking the Kool-Aid and all of that. Conan is this, this rugged, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, this, bodybuilding guy who goes to fight the snake cult, basically. And he's an individual, right? It's the cult, right? The cult collectivism against the hardworking, wild frontier individualism. It's a libertarian, it's a Reagan-esque libertarian film, right? It's about individualism against collectivism, but it's also against the new left, seeing the new left as and it's family values, right? Family values, traditional family, that kind of thing. It's very much, very, very much a right-wing movie, and it came out in 1982, height of the Reagan Revolution. And you watch Conan the Barbarian. It very much is that. Now, apparently, Conan the Barbarian is based on some like adventure novels that came out a long time prior to that. There were like these adventure novels that were written, that came out in like the 1930s, I believe, that were quite popular. But yeah, the film that came out, I see that as very much a conservative film. But a couple other things are on my mind while we're here tonight. We're talking about movies. I was just thinking today about what we could talk about. I talked to you all about Ian Fleming. If you roll back, I'm talking about Ian Fleming and what he's about. I talked about 1776 and Hamilton. I talked about Spartacus. I just talked to you all about Conan the Barbarian. There's a couple other things that are on my mind that I wanted to mention. And that one thing that we have developed with CPI is we have talked a lot about the Boston trap. I've started referring to it as the Boston trap. And it was really a negative turning point in the history of American politics. 1974 in Boston. 1974 in Boston, there were racist riots against busing, right? And that was, that the courts of Boston ordered the schools of Boston to be integrated, racially integrated by busing children. Instead of having schools in the community where you lived, you would be assigned to a random school. And that was to make sure there was not a black school and a white school so that equal education could be provided. And in Boston, you have a lot of Irish Catholics, who were racist, didn't want their kids to go to school with black people. And they rioted against it. And for a couple years, there was a lot of violence in Boston against it. And what happened it was a very nuanced situation. So first of all, one of the main driving forces behind busing was austerity, was the Ford Foundation, that the urban political machines of the Democrat Party are a barrier to austerity. Those white Catholic Bostonians who were racist, they were also members of labor unions. They were also Democrats. And they also tended to be the cops and the firemen, and they tended to hand out the goods, and that they were a voting bloc that was very, very powerful. And if you wanted to impose cuts in public services, if you wanted to impose austerity, those ethnic urban Catholic communities were very powerful. Rural areas in the United States tend to be Protestant, except for like Wisconsin, Minnesota, right? Up north, you tend to have, Wisconsin, Minnesota, you have rural Catholics. But for the most part, rural areas, small farmers tended to be Protestant, smaller town folks tend to be Protestant, whereas it's urban folks that are Roman Catholic, right? Your Italians, your Irish, or Eastern European folks who live in urban areas, they tend to be Roman Catholic. And that's why prohibition was created, right? The Democratic Party is very much the party of urban political machines. And that Woodrow Wilson, was the president of the United States, who was a Democrat, but the urban political machines opposed him, and they were Catholic. So Woodrow Wilson created the Ku Klux Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan was used to win rural folks away from the Republican Party to the Democrat Party, and to push back against the urban political machines of the Democrat Party as well. And Woodrow Wilson, basically the main achievement of the Ku Klux Klan was prohibition, because Protestants did not drink alcohol and Catholics did. That was one of the biggest differences between Protestants and Catholics. And you go back to the 19-teens, the 1920s, was urban Catholics drank, right? Catholics, they drank, right? It's, Irish Catholics drink, Italians drink, but in, conservative American Protestants, historically, not anymore. Nowadays, Protestants drink for the most part, but historically, Protestant Christian Americans, rural folks, didn't believe in drinking. They thought drinking was sinful, comes out of the Puritan heritage. So the Ku Klux Klan, the great achievement of the Ku Klux Klan was they got prohibition passed, and alcohol was actually outlawed in the United States, and that the urban political machines were becoming overwhelmingly Catholic, Irish, Italian, Eastern European folks who drank alcohol, who were, often spoke their native language if it wasn't English, and that there was a lot of fear of immigrants. And so the Ku Klux Klan was the Democratic Party trying to weaken the power of the urban political machines, trying to win Republicans, because small farmers in rural areas tended to be Republican, win them to the Democrat Party by saying that the Republicans were the party of Lincoln, who'd betrayed the white people, and then push back against Roman Catholics. And the Klan, the 1920s and 30s Ku Klux Klan, very much focused on Catholics. Racism against Black people was just assumed. It's Jim Crow was in effect in the South. And, the Klan certainly hated Black people, no question about it, lynched Black people, murdered Black people. But the focus of their propaganda tended to be against Catholics, because they believed that the Catholic Church was trying to take over the United States. They spread the conspiracy theory that Catholics were moving to the United States and having lots of children so they could outvote the Protestants, and then the USA would be taken over by the Vatican. That the Catholics were secretly loyal agents of the Vatican, and that they were moving to the United States and having lots of kids so the USA would become a colony of the Vatican. That was largely what the Klan went around saying during the 1920s. And so you had these urban political machines of Roman Catholics. And that's the stereotype, Irish cops and Irish firemen and the Italian mafia. And urban political life, white people in urban areas tended to be Roman Catholic, whereas white people in rural areas tended to be Protestant. Rural areas tend to be Republican. Urban centers in the United States tend to be Democrat. Boston, like any other urban center in the United States, was largely Democrats who were Roman Catholics. And they were the cops, they were the firemen, they were members of labor unions, and they were racist, but they were also very much anti-austerity. They wanted to, they would vote as a bloc, and they would, maintain government funding, and they wanted government spending, and they were pro-growth, and they favored Roosevelt economic policies. They were just racist. And so busing, right, and school integration was a way to break apart those urban political machines that had a lot of power, right? And that's why the ultra-rich were pushing it. Also, one of the main opponents of busing was not white racists, it was black nationalists. The Nation of Islam was against busing. The Black Panthers were against busing. And that doesn't get talked about. But the Black Panthers wanted separate schools for black children. And in Oakland, California, they actually set one up. The Black Panthers had their own high school in Oakland, California. And the Nation of Islam to this day has its own high school. And they very much want separate schools for black children. They feel that a black student doesn't get a chance in a school run by white people. And that they very much wanted that. And that was a demand that the Black Panthers and black nationalists had largely been advocating. So they did not want school busing. The civil rights movement wanted busing. Martin Luther King Jr. had wanted school integration and such. But the black nationalist movement that was on the rise in the early 70s, the classic civil rights stuff had pretty much been usurped by black nationalism at that point. They were not in favor of school busing. They wanted black schools for black children. So the black nationalists were against it. And then, these urban political machines that were racist, they didn't want it. And it seemed like the Ford Foundation and a lot of the wealthy ultra-rich were pushing busing because they wanted to bring austerity. They wanted to break apart these populist, economic, Democratic Party urban political machines. They wanted to break apart those neighborhoods where all the Irish Catholics voted together as a bloc and voted to hire lots of firefighters and pay the teachers a good salary. They wanted to break that apart. The way to bring degrowth and austerity was to break apart the neighborhoods, break apart that ethnic solidarity. And were these people racist? Absolutely, they were racist. I'm not saying that the Bostonians who were against busing were not racist. They absolutely were. But in their racism, they were also against austerity. And so busing was being promoted by the ultra-rich for their own reasons. And so it put the left in this weird spot of, what do you do, right? So the Black Panthers, right, and communist groups historically supported black nationalism. They supported black nationalism, and the black nationalists did not want school busing. Meanwhile, labor unions and these kind of groups that were popular among the Democratic Party and all that, they were against school busing. So it would make sense for communist groups to be against busing, except racism was largely what was being used to justify opposing busing. It was very much, we don't want our kids to go to school with black people. That was the thrust of what the anti-busing rioters were saying. And they were committing hate crimes. They would target black children. They would target school buses. There's an ethnic slur they would use for a black child. They'd call them a DSEG. That's horrendous, right? And there were a lot of black children who were beaten up. There were a lot of school buses that were attacked and had the windows broken and stuff. So it's like, it put the left in this very, very odd situation. What do you do? Now, the response of the left was different, okay? So the Communist Party, they supported busing because they support the Democrats, right? And the Democrats were for busing. They support the liberals. Liberals were for busing. The Socialist Workers Party, they also supported busing because they were for busing. The Maoist groups, because supporting black nationalism was so integral to what the Maoist groups did, they were a little bit different. The October League, which was a big Maoist group, they never said they were against busing, but they published articles by black nationalists who were against busing, which was very like a careful thing. They would kind of boost black nationalist voices who were against busing, and they wouldn't say anything about it. And the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, they're infamous for the fact that they supported the anti-busing riots. They said, the workers must unite to smash busing. That was the headline in their newspaper. And they argued that communism was the answer, not busing. And they tried to recruit out of the anti-busing movement. And then the Workers' World Party that I was in for 8 years, their proudest moment was when they built 1974, a big rally called We Say No to Racism. And they sent all their members to Boston, and they organized a very, very liberal rally called We Say No to Racism, in which it was the first time they'd ever concealed the party, and they allowed they had Democrats as the main speakers. They concealed the communist background, and they just had a very liberal rally to support busing. And they upheld that as their proudest moment of, like, you know, there was this racist movement in Boston, which was racist against school busing. And we organized we were very, very useful to the liberal wing of the ruling class, and that we, as communists, we concealed our politics and we organized the big rally, the massive rally attended by liberals, and basically gave a platform to the Democrats to oppose, the racism in Boston. And that was their shining moment. And I call that the Boston Trap, because I was in Workers' World Party from 2007 to 2015. Every conference I ever went to, every year we'd have a national conference, there would always be a speech about the 1974 Boston We Say No to Racism protest. Every year, they talked about it nonstop. It was the best thing they had ever done. And I look at that now and I see what's going on with Trump and how they have Trump derangement syndrome, and how Trump represents the wing of the ruling class that is less pro-war, that is less pro-FBI. Trump is doing a lot of bad things I don't agree with, but we're slightly better off with Trump than we would have been with Kamala Harris, and that Trump is appealing to anti-establishment sentiments with his Bonapartism. And I see how the left lost their minds over Trump and got Trump derangement syndrome, and the left became pro-FBI, and the left became basically pro-war and all of that. And I think about the Boston Trap. I call it the Boston Trap because the memo got sent out. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, they became the bad example because they supported the racist riots against busing. And the memo got sent out that if you support anything that is quote unquote right wing, you're therefore supporting racism and you're awful. And look, the RCP was awful. If you actually read the articles that the RCP wrote defending their position on busing, if you read the articles they wrote, they actually make some interesting points. And they say that you shouldn't be expecting the American government to be the champion of black people, and you shouldn't be dismissing all the white working class people as a bunch of racists, and that the busing program was dividing the working class. And if you read it, they actually make some very coherent arguments. And ultimately, has busing in Boston been a success? No, right? I mean, did the lives of black people in Boston get better because of busing? No, right? I mean, obviously the racist movement against busing, committing hate crimes and all that, you can't endorse that. But was busing the answer? No. And busing has led to school choice and school privatization. It has led to weakening teachers' unions. It's led to austerity and cuts in government. I mean, austerity, the Ford Foundation and the wealthy ultra rich who were backing busing for their own reasons knew what they were doing. And that, the racist white folks who were against busing and the black nationalists who were also against busing, they may not have articulated it very well. The black nationalists certainly articulated it better, but the white folks, clearly they were just being racist. But if you really look at it, busing was against their economic interest. And that busing in the name of, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, everybody got poorer. The white workers got poorer. The black people got poorer. Everybody got poorer as a result, right? Rather than improving education for everybody, they made education inclusive and everyone got worse education. Right. And it's pretty wild. If you look at it, busing hasn't worked out too well. Obviously, racism isn't the answer, but busing was not the solution. And the anti-busing movement was based on a vague understanding, especially the black nationalists really understood. They wanted good schools in the black community for black children, and that busing wasn't going to get them that. And it didn't. Right. And the racist white Bostonians, they were just being racist. But at the same time, there was an understanding that just, integrating the schools is not going to make education better. And that in the long term, it led to breaking apart the urban machines of the Democratic Party and implementing austerity. And if you look at it, busing really fed austerity, but it was austerity sold in the name of anti-racism. and that but they created a trap. It was the Boston trap, where obviously, if you're a good leftist, if you're anti-racist, you can't align yourself with a movement that's attacking black children. You can't do that, right? I mean, you can't align yourself with people that are using racial slurs, that are committing hate crimes. You can't do that. So it puts you into this corner where you have to align with the ultra rich. And it's actually very brilliant on the part of the ruling class. And they create a situation where they're imposing their agenda, but the people who oppose them are doing their opposition in such a vulgar, disgusting, hateful way. It backs you into a corner, right? And that's kind of what we're dealing with the Trump situation, right? Trump is, at this point, it looks like he's making peace with Russia. And Trump, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, it's not going to be used to suppress anti-imperialist voices anymore. And that Trump is pushing back on a lot of what the ultra-rich would like to do. However, he's using very, very vulgar, racist language. He's doing awful things at the same time with El Salvador and all of that. So it creates this awful situation where, in the name of your values, in the name of being anti-racist, you have to align with the ultra-rich. It creates a brilliant maneuver, right? The Boston trap is a very, very effective maneuver on the part of the ruling class. But anyway, that brings me to a point that I realized today, right? And again, this is just stuff I've been thinking about, right? So I've been doing a lot of research into Paula White Cain. Now, Paula White Cain is Donald Trump's pastor, Donald Trump's spiritual advisor. And she is very much an advocate of what you could call the prosperity gospel. God wants you to be rich, abundance, etc. And Paula White Cain, she has a church in Miami. She works in the White House at the Faith Office. Donald Trump gave her a job at the White House as the White House Faith Office director. She has an office in the White House, and she's Paula White Cain. She's Donald Trump's pastor. And Donald Trump likes her because he grew up listening to Norman Vincent Peale, who was the guy who did The Power of Positive Thinking, which was a very popular self-help book. He was a pastor in New York City who did The Power of Positive Thinking, kind of a really key, pivotal self-help guy in the 1950s. That was Donald Trump's pastor. And Paula White Cain comes from his school of religious thought, of, abundance, etc. And I was thinking about Paula White Cain, and then I remembered Marilyn Ferguson. So who is Marilyn Ferguson? Marilyn Ferguson visited the Bill Clinton White House many times, and she was not Bill Clinton's spiritual advisor. She was Al Gore, the vice president, Al Gore's spiritual advisor. And I've written a lot about Marilyn Ferguson. Marilyn Ferguson, she's not a Christian. She's a pagan. She's an occultist, right? She claims to be a psychic, that she's hearing voices from other dimensions, etc. And Marilyn Ferguson wrote the book, The Aquarian Conspiracy. And I was thinking about this, and I was reading about Paula White Cain, and then I was remembering how I did a deep dive into Marilyn Ferguson, and I realized, oh my God, American politics is a fight between Paula White Cain and Marilyn Ferguson. If you really want to understand the divisions taking place, I talk a lot about divisions in the ruling class, the rich versus the ultra-rich, the managerial bourgeoisie versus the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie. There's a spiritual war going on between the paganism of Marilyn Ferguson and the prosperity gospel Christianity of Paula White Cain. When it really gets down to it, it's brilliant. So Marilyn Ferguson, right? Her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, argues there's a big explosion coming that will bring the world back into balance, right? That we're out of balance with nature, and that we need to bring the world back into balance, and that there's a big explosion going on, and that we, with psychedelic drugs and with all kinds of occult practices and all of that, we can set the stage for the big explosion that's going to come and bring the world back into balance with nature. And she's an environmentalist. She believes in overpopulation. There's too many people in the world. There's limited resources on our planet. And she says she's not pro-communist or anti-communist. She's pro-humanity. And she says this big explosion is going to destroy the Soviet Union as well as America, and that the whole world is going to be reinvented by this great explosion that's coming to bring the world back into balance. It's a little scary if you read between the lines. She's predicting some gigantic apocalypse that will reduce the population and it'll bring us back into balance. She's a Malthusian. She's anti-human. And, she's like, the Aquarian conspiracy that she's building, and it's, scientists and doctors and politicians and all of that. They're all preparing to set the stage for the big explosion that'll bring the world back into balance. She's preaching degrowth. She's preaching for some big apocalypse to come. She's it's pretty intense. And I always point out that, Al Gore was widely mocked because he said, I invented the internet. I invented the internet. Well, what he meant was that he set out the government policies that funded the research that, DARPA and all that led to that. And what he's referring to is Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley was created by U.S. government. The free market did not create the computer revolution. It was the government. It was state policies. You can go back to Brzezinski, who wrote about the technotronic age. And it was the intelligence agencies very much decided to get the U.S. government, get the United States to be at the center of the computer revolution. And Marilyn Ferguson, in her writing, she very much talked about, she says in her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, one of the quotes from the book is she says, America is free, but California is freer. And she specifically highlights the Stanford Research Institute, Stanford University Research Institute, as being the center of what she calls the Aquarian Conspiracy, which is her plan for a pagan revolution to reinvent the world. And Stanford Research Institute, that's where Silicon Valley comes out of, right? That's where all the research and that's where all the funding and all the computer revolution comes out of. Stanford Research Institute is also a CIA hub. That's, the liberal CIA. That's all kinds of CIA research. Google Stanford Research Institute and CIA and see what comes up. And so, if you look at that, Marilyn Ferguson, who was at the Bill Clinton White House, who was the advisor to Al Gore, who, Al Gore oversaw making the internet and you look at it, right? Degrowth, a global revolution like George Soros wants, right? Like the Arab Spring, the Hillary Clinton State Department, all that. Human beings are a cancer and we need the world to be reinvented, and then Paula White Cain. What is Paula White Cain? She says God wants you to be rich and God has given you the tools, and that, if you dig into your spiritual energy, you can figure out how to make abundance and you look at Paula White Cain, but it's more than just growth versus degrowth. I mean, that's really what it gets down to. Paula White Cain wants economic growth, and Marilyn Ferguson says we need degrowth, right? So they're spiritual. One is a pagan, one is a Christian. One wants an apocalypse to destroy growth and get the world, quote, back into balance. The other is a Christian, and she believes in economic growth, right? And she believes God wants you to be rich, and she believes in a psychology of abundance. But it's more than just that. This is the age-old fight between the temple priesthood and the prophet. The temple priesthood and the prophet. So I've talked a lot about the prophet Jeremiah. All right? Ancient Israel, you have the prophet Jeremiah, and Jeremiah comes along and he's calling for Israel to repent. And he's saying that the temple priesthood is corrupt because there's the rich people in ancient Israel are committing human sacrifices, and they're straying from the law, and they're abandoning the poor and the widows and orphans, and they're mistreating the foreigners and all of that. And he's saying that the kingdom of Israel, they need to repent or they're going to be destroyed, or God's going to destroy them. And who persecutes Jeremiah? The priesthood, because the priesthood is corrupt and they're finding loopholes and they're allowing the human sacrifices and the sex orgies, and they're allowing the widows and orphans to be mistreated, and they're allowing the mistreatment, right? And so the temple priesthood is corrupt, and the temple priesthood, you have to be born into it, right? I believe, if I understand correctly, to be a priest in the the temple in ancient Israel, it was hereditary. You had to be born into it. I believe if your last name is Cohen, that means coin, and that means you're somebody who would have been one of the temple priesthood. And that the priesthood is corrupt. And so Jeremiah, right, he's not a priest. He's just a guy. And he says that he's got the gift of prophecy, that God speaks through him, and that he's building a movement of people outside the temple condemning the temple priesthood. And the priesthood hates him. And they say, how are you qualified to talk about religion? You're just some guy. We're the priesthood. We're officially here. We are part of the official temple. We have gone through the official training to become priests. Who are you? You're just some guy talking about religion. You have no right to talk about this. And you say, well, you've got God within you, but you don't. We're the temple priesthood, the official temple, the official institution. And you, Jeremiah, are just a normal person, and you're out there screaming and yelling and condemning us. And the temple priesthood persecuted Jeremiah. And, but then obviously what happened? Babylon invades, and the temple, the Jewish people are subjected to 70 years of captivity. And the whole time they're saying Jeremiah was right? If only we had listened to Jeremiah. And that's the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament. The Jewish people are held in bondage, in slavery. And they're saying, if only we had repented of our ways, if only we'd listened to Jeremiah, we wouldn't be colonized and oppressed by the Babylonians. We wouldn't be in Babylonian exile and captivity, etc. Right. And so then Jeremiah becomes the archetype of a Hebrew prophet. Right. And then, I've talked times about, John the Baptist. He was a voice crying out in the wilderness, right, is what he called himself. Right. He wore camel skin, and he's not a priest. He's not a Pharisee. He's just a guy, proclaiming repentance and the word of the Lord. He's modeling himself on Jeremiah. And then when Jesus goes to the temple in Jerusalem and drives out the money changers, what does Jesus say? He says, you've turned my father's house into a den of thieves. And those are the words of the prophet Jeremiah. That's what Jeremiah gathered all the people outside the temple in Jerusalem and said, my father's house is turned into a den of thieves. Right. Right. And that the prophet hates the temple priesthood, and the priesthood hates the temple priesthood hates the prophet. And that if you look at this is something that plays out throughout the history of religion and in a lot of other institutions, right? There's an institution that exists, and there are people that rise up through the institutions. And then there are rabble rousers and creative people and innovators who do it on their own and get a following. And the temple music is a great example, right? There's mainstream record labels, and there's, the popular music scene. And then there's people that just make their own music. They make their own innovative indie music and invent their own music, right? And the big record labels are always trying to, co-opt, if some independent artist is out there doing some good kind of music, the big record labels are going to want to co-opt it and make it their own. Right. And politics, right? In politics, you generally have people who go to Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League schools, and first they're congressional staffers, and then they run for office here, and they go up the ranks. And that's Kamala Harris, that's Joe Biden, that's the political machine as it currently exists. They follow all the rules and they go through everything, and that's the temple priesthood. Whereas agitators and rabble rousers and people that are outsiders, they're the prophet, right? They're doing it on their own, and the temple priesthood says, who are they? Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and all these people that played the game. They say, who are you to talk about politics? You don't know anything about this. Who are you? And these people say, well, what's good that we're not trained in your corrupt institution? It's good that we're coming from the outside, because this institution is corrupt, and that this is a dynamic that exists everywhere. Paula White Cain is very much an outsider, right? She's from a very, very wealthy Southern family, but then her father committed suicide when she was young. Her family was poor. She discovered Christianity as a younger person, and she became a pastor herself, and she built her various churches, and she's an outsider. Marilyn Ferguson went up through the Ivy League institutions. Marilyn Ferguson was at Stanford, at the Stanford Research Institute, and she was the spiritual advisor to Al Gore. And she's very much the temple priesthood. She's the corrupt the corrupt institution of spirituality for the ultra rich in America that enables their crimes and their decadent ways. Paula White Cain is an outsider, a self-made woman who discovered religion and went on her own and worked hard and built her own church. And that you look at this is a dynamic that you see in a lot of places, is the existing institution becomes corrupt. And so people outside of those institutions build up a following, right? And that the temple priesthood versus the prophet, right? And I mean, Jesus fighting with the Pharisees, and there's so many examples of this, of like the institution becomes corrupt. The institution of politics becomes corrupt, so you get agitators on the outside. The institution of religion becomes corrupt. The temple priesthood becomes corrupt, so you get prophets on the outside. The music scene becomes dead, and so you get indie artists on the outside, right? There's many in every field of culture. This is kind of what happens, right? Is you have a corrupt institution, and then you have outsiders that emerge, and you have this rivalry between the corrupt institution and the outsider. And then of course it's never that clear, right? For example, right, the temple priesthood might try to find a prophet of their own. They might find one of their own people and say, all right, people are mad at the temple and the priesthood, so you go put on tattered clothes and you go outside and you sound like a prophet. And that might work, and he's a false prophet. He's just a representation of the temple priesthood trying to be a prophet. But in order for people to follow him, he still has to sound like a prophet. Whereas the temple priest, there might be a prophet who gets to be popular, and then the temple priesthood approaches him and says, hey, you're such a good rabble rouser, you're such an agitator, why don't you join us? And they recruit him, and he keeps being a prophet, but he's in bed with the temple priesthood. There's millions of examples of this, and this plays out in so many different institutions, right? Of the temple priesthood versus the prophet, right? And this is a dynamic that exists. I mean, I wear this ring. This is an Islamic Akek ring. And what it represents is the prophet Jeremiah, who was not from a priesthood, right? Was in ancient Arabia. And they were pagan at the time. They worshiped different deities, and he built a movement for the one true God. And then they seized the temple at Mecca that was full of pagan idols, and they smashed the idols. And so he wore a piece of one of the idols that they had smashed on his finger to commemorate the victory of the one true God over the temple at Mecca. And that's what the Islamic Akek ring stands for. And that's, again, the prophet Muhammad is a prophet, and he's rising up against the corrupt temple that's run by pagans, and then he's smashing the pagans. So I think about this, and it's like, Paula White Cain, very much sees herself as I don't think she would call herself a prophet, but she's a religious leader that's an outsider and that is preaching growth and abundance and wealth. Marilyn Ferguson is a spiritual guru who most people have never heard of because she really only preached to rich people, and she's preaching degrowth and depopulation. And you think about that. And what's interesting, though, is that this says a lot about America. America was started very much by followers of prophets, right? That, it was people who came to this country because they were religious dissenters. They thought that the Church of England was corrupt. They thought that the Catholic Church was corrupt, and they came to a new country. That America was started by people who were at odds with the prevailing religious institutions that existed, and came here so they could practice their religion in their own way. They felt they were connected with a higher power. They felt that the religious authorities were corrupt. Also, America was started by people who wanted to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, people who wanted to make money, people who wanted to go and get rich and work hard, right? And that's the fight between the managerial bourgeoisie and the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie when you think about it. So, when I think about Paula White Cain versus Marilyn Ferguson, I think we can learn a lot about America, right? And that Donald Trump, right, as a capitalist, right, as a wealthy capitalist who's not part of the club, Paula White Cain as a prosperity preacher who's saying that God wants you to be rich, work really, really hard and be rich. And they're up against an institution, the institutions of U.S. society that are preaching Malthusianism at this point. that are preaching degrowth, that are preaching that human beings are a cancer, that are preaching that we need heavy-handed government control to drive down living standards, and we need to stop the productive forces from expanding because of climate change. This is the fight that we're in, and we see this fight playing out from many, many different sides and many different levels. And so, those are my thoughts for you all tonight. That's my opening message for tonight. I hope you got something out of it. We went on for a little bit longer than we usually go on, but that's fine. And I know a lot of people have actually sent Rumble rants for me to answer, and I do appreciate that. So names and locations, folks, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations, names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Who is with us tonight? Connor in Colorado. Woo! Connor is awesome. Alex in Brazil. Ryan in Kansas City. Mariah in North Carolina. Blessings. Happy Monday. Chad in Spokane, Washington. Alyssa in Virginia. Jenny in Cincinnati. Auckland, New Zealand. Penny in Minnesota. Just had a great meetup, by the way. Alexander in Norway. Brooklyn in the house via Dallas. Phil is out in Dallas. Great work, Phil. Phil in Miami. The other Phil in Miami. Very, very good. Cyrus in Cornwall. Anthony in Detroit. Ario Grande in California. Arlene in Wisconsin. Brad in Cleveland. Great opening thoughts tonight. Well, thank you. St. David's, Bermuda. Jacob in Tennessee. The seasoned noob from China. Jacob in Wisconsin. Viking Dave. Arg. Is that what Vikings say? Do they say arg? Or no, that's a pirate. Lawrence Johnson in Chicago. L Mission in San Francisco. Herb Bryant in Tampa, Florida. Orange County, California. Tammy Elisa. Very, very good. John McCarthy. John McPeace in Chicago. Names and locations. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Oh, Eugene in Vladivostok, Russia, in the Far East. A from MD from Maryland. Very, very good. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. All right. So just a reminder, if you've got a question tonight, right, you can send questions via Rumble Rant, as many people already have, or you can Cash App me at Caleb Maupin 22. That's the best way to send a donation or a question if you got it, is Cash App 22. Gabby in Chicago doing great work as always. I just had a great meetup in Chicago. Gabby's been reading with folks and teaching them about innovationism. She's doing a great job. And we have a lot of people that are really, really dedicated to our message. I am so thankful for everybody, for, Penny and if I start naming people, I'm going to forget somebody, but John in Chicago and Noah in Boston. And we just got so many good people in our organization who are really, really dedicated to what we're about. Connor in Colorado, and oh man, just so many people. It's every time we have a Zoom meeting, I am just blown away by how many people really get the beauty of innovationism and our anti-imperialist, pro-humanity, pro-growth message and how important it is. And I'm really blown away by that. The Center for Political Innovation, we have something really, really special. I can't really communicate it to you. It's really, really amazing. But we need you to come to our convention. We're having our convention this summer in Chicago, Illinois. We need you to be there. It's going to be the biggest event we have ever done. Over 400 people. It's going to be packed. And I'm every day thinking about Chicago. There's so much great work that is going to happen. And I'm trying to get everything lined up in time and get everything to be the way it needs to be. And, there's a lot that needs to happen. It's going to be a really, really amazing convention. It's going to be really awesome. And I really hope that you will be there, because it's going to be absolutely tremendous. You can register at the link down below. There's a QR code there on the screen. It's going to be the biggest event we've ever done. It's going to be absolutely awesome. I see that a few people have sent questions they would like me to answer. This is how to send your questions. We can put some music on. That is one thing we do on these streams, is that we do play music. And I do need to rest my voice a little bit before I start answering the questions. I want to put on a song that will, that will inspire people. I want to put on something that's inspiring. What should I put on? What would be inspiring? I know we'll put on, this is an old communist song. It's originally from Poland. We'll put this on. Why not? Right? We play all kinds of music. This is a communist song that was originally from Poland. And then it was a radical song from Poland called the Warsawian, after Warsaw. And then the Bolsheviks adopted it at the time of the Russian Revolution, and they turned it into Whirlwinds of Danger, is what the Bolsheviks called it. I have always particularly liked Whirlwinds of Danger. It's got kind of that dark, dark revolutionary edge to it. If I can just get the clip to download, I will put on Whirlwinds of Danger, the classic revolutionary song. There's a version of it that is in Spanish. I believe the Spanish version, I believe, is called A las Barricadas. If you've ever heard of that, A las Barricadas, which was the anthem of one of the Spanish labor unions. I believe the anarchist Spanish labor union used it as their anthem. Very different lyrics. A las Barricadas is to the barricades. But yeah, this is called Whirlwinds of Danger. I'm just trying to get the link to download here. I don't know why it's being annoying here. Yeah, hold on. Oh, okay. I think I got one. All right. Hold on. Here it comes. Okay. All right. Here it is. This is Whirlwinds of Danger, a classic Marxist anthem that was used in the Russian Revolution. Our heritage here, we're no longer Marxists. We're innovationists. We're in a new stage, and we realize a lot of the problems with Marxism, but that's part of our heritage, and we admire what was achieved in the countries that broke out of imperialism, the countries that use socialist methods to raise themselves up. And we are obviously opposed to imperialism. We support those who oppose imperialism. So here we go. This is to our heritage, in honor of our heritage. This is this is Whirlwinds of Danger. Here we go. Oh boy, I'm sorry. I want to get the original version. Hold on. This guy wrote new lyrics. I want to show the original version. So hold on. We'll do a version with the original lyrics. Yeah. Hold on. All right. So this is a version with the original correct lyrics. So here we go. All right, hold on. All right. Hold on. Right. You all know the tune. It's that, it's just a classic tune. I mean, if you listen to Marxist music long enough, you've heard the dun 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 dun. Anyway, all right. Okay, so we're gonna put on Whirlwinds of Danger. Hold on. All right. Whirlwinds of Danger. Here we go.
Whirlwinds of danger are raging around us, overwhelming forces of darkness assail, still in the fight to see advancing before us, red flag of liberty that yet shall prevail. Then forward, ye workers free, sail for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Whirlwinds of danger are raging around us, overwhelming forces of darkness assail. Still in the fight, see advancing before us, red flag of liberty that yet shall prevail. Then, poetry workers, freedom awaits you, for all the world on land and the sea. On with the fight for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Brothers and sisters in hunger are calling. Shall we be silent to their sorrow and woe? While in the fight, see our comrades are falling up. Then united and conquer the foe. Then poetry workers, freedom awaits you, for all the world on land and the sea. On with the fight for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Off with the crowns of the tyrants of favor, down in the dust with the prince and the bear. Strike off your chains, sons and daughters of labor. Wake all humanity, for victory is near. Then poetry workers, freedom awaits you, for all the world on land and the sea. On with the fight for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Death to the kings and the rich parasites, tremble before our sacred rage. The old order down we shall strike, crops of the future harvest we will. Then poetry workers, freedom awaits you, for all the world on land and the sea. On with the fight for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Negras tormentas agitan los aires, nubes oscuras nos impiden ver, aunque nos espere el dolor y la muerte, contra el enemigo nos llama al deber. El bien más preciado es la libertad, hay que defenderla con fe y con valor. Alta la bandera revolucionaria, que de triunfo sin cesar lo lleva en pos. Alta la bandera revolucionaria, que de triunfo sin cesar lo lleva en pos. En pie, pueblo vero, a la batalla hay que derrotar a la reacción. A las barricadas, por el triunfo de la confederación. A las barricadas, por el triunfo de la confederación.
All righty. So there you go. Always a classic. Yeah, that's good stuff. All right. So Gabby sent a super chat. So she just has to tell me her question. And then we'll start answering other people's questions as well. So yeah, scrolling up on the Rumble to start answering other people's questions. But Gabby, yeah, just send me your question because I got your. Oh, there we go. So Gabby is asking, why does the current system seem to function best during times of crisis or when there's overproduction and confusion around value, rather than focusing on stable, healthy growth? And why are global elites promoting degrowth policies in developed countries, even though these policies often seem to hurt ordinary people more than help? What's the real motive behind the agenda? Well, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, I guess we'll do the second part first. Why are the global elites promoting degrowth policies in developed countries? Because that's the way to stabilize the system, right? During the Great Depression, one of the things that Roosevelt did to try and keep the price of dairy high and to the price of beef high was he killed half the cows in the country. And the Department of Agriculture went out and they killed half the cows in the country and they poured lime on the bodies so no one could dig them up and eat the meat. And that was to make the price of beef go up because there was overproduction of beef. There was so much beef, there were so many cows that the price of beef was causing the farms to shut down. So they implemented degrowth and they killed half the cows in the country. And then the price of beef doubled. And Nelson Peary talks about that in his autobiography. Degrowth policies driving down productive forces makes the crisis of overproduction. It's a way to temporarily hold it off. And that, Nazi economics, Nazi Germany was largely, they called it reverse inflation, that you reduce the amount that is there. And then the prices of overproduction goes away, right? To resolve the prices of overproduction, you destroy productive forces, right? When there's a glut on the market, you destroy a bunch of the stuff and you make it harder to produce stuff. And then there's no longer a glut on the market. And that's why they're implementing degrowth policies, is that the idea is that because the crisis of overproduction, the crisis of poverty created by abundance is causing a problem, you destroy the abundance, right? You just reduce consumption, you destroy the productive capacity. And it's a way to resolve a crisis of overproduction. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing a situation where to reduce living standards, reduce consumption, reduce the productive capacity, and resolve the crisis. Make us pay for the crisis the rich created. It's called austerity, right? They created the crisis, but we have to pay for it. And by driving down our living standards, by destroying the productive capacity, you can then try to reboot the economy, right? And it's a totally irrational problem. Now, the first part of the question, right? The first part of the question is, why does the current system seem to function best during times of crisis, or when there's overproduction and confusion around value, rather than focusing on stable? I wouldn't say that the system functions the best during a crisis. The system functions the worst during a crisis. I mean, the value crisis, when the market is glutted with products that can't be sold, when there's all kinds of products on the market that can't be sold, and the government is having to buy billions of dollars. I mean, that's not when the system is functioning best. That's when the system is functioning the worst. I mean, there's many examples that we could talk about, but hydraulic fracking, right, caused the market to be flooded with oil, and that was a situation where you had at that point very low oil prices, because there was too much oil, right? And so people were losing their jobs in the oil industry, and fracking companies were closing down and all that because there was too much oil. I mean, that's not the system functioning best. That's the system very much coming to a grinding halt. I mean, a value crisis of overproduction and economic glut generally that's when the system is working. I mean, it comes to a grinding halt because the market is glutted with products that can't be sold. The value of those commodities dramatically decreases because there's so many of them, making them not sellable, making enterprises shut down. And the weird thing is that we constantly have that. I mean, the government is constantly doing things, constantly buying military hardware, constantly buying agricultural goods. Food stamps is something to deal with the crisis of overproduction. It's a subsidy to American agribusiness so that we keep selling food that we wouldn't normally sell, so that, you know, the farms, the price of food items stays high enough that the agribusiness corporations don't go out of business. There's many examples of, we have a situation where the government spends money actively just to keep the economy going. And that's in normal times. That's not during a crisis. The crisis comes when there's a big technological leap, right? In order for the American economy to just normally function, the government has to be buying all kinds of food items and burying them in caves. The government has to be, giving people food stamps so they can keep buying food when they're low income. The government has to be hiring all kinds of teachers. The government has to be constantly spending money and putting more spending power into the economy just to function at normal. But a crisis like we're in now is when there's a huge technological leap that completely renegotiates the rules of the game. Look, even in the good old days of the 1950s, there was a huge amount of government stimulus in the U.S. economy to hold off a crisis of overproduction. That's when the military-industrial complex started, for example. So there you go. It's a good question, Gabby. Good question. All right. So Leo Messi says, yo, sup, we going to touch on Sorry to Bother You. And then other people pointed out he's referring to the movie Sorry to Bother You, starring Boots Riley, right? So I didn't know what Leo Messi was saying but I have not actually seen that movie. I have met Boots Riley. I actually did a long interview with Boots Riley, which I wish I had the video of. They wrote an article based on the interview, but I really wish I had the video of my interview with Boots Riley, because I just sat down with him for a good hour and we just talked. Unfortunately, I never posted that video online because it was done in the capacity of my job. And anyway, but I had a long chat with Boots Riley out in Oakland, California, right after Trump got elected the first time. I went out there to cover the riots, and Boots Riley was there, and we just sat down and we had a chat, and it was actually a good conversation. And I really like Boots Riley in a lot of ways, but I've never seen his movie. I never saw the movie that he made, which is called Sorry to Bother You, which is, I understand it's about the struggle to unionize call centers. And I worked at many call centers when I was getting out of college. So, I might be able to relate to some of the content in the film. Theater of War, 2022, official trailer. All right, I'm not going to show a trailer for a film on here, but, that was Hemp Carr sent Theater of War, which is a good documentary about the Department of Defense making films. Okay, so that's, about the relationship between the military and the film industry. Okay, very good. It's called Theater of War. Very good. All right. John McPeace says the National Iranian Action Council has a good statement about the explosion at a port in Bandar Abbas. So let's take a look at that. The National Iranian American Council is shocked and deeply saddened by the devastating explosions in Bandar Abbas, Iran, which tragically claimed the lives of 40 people and left 1,200 people injured. Our hearts go out to the victims and their families and the entire Bandar Abbas community. We extend our gratitude and solidarity to the first responders risking their lives to contain the fires. The cause of this catastrophic explosion, which tore through Iran's largest commercial port and endangered countless innocent lives, must be fully and transparently investigated, as reports circulate suggesting potential sabotage, including the possibility of foreign involvement. It is critical that all avenues are explored to uncover the truth and ensure accountability and prioritize the safety of civilians. This tragedy comes at a critical moment when diplomacy between Iran and the United States is desperately needed to reduce tensions and further prevent the loss of life. We urge all parties to exercise restraint and prioritize the protection of civilians over escalations. The National Iranian American Council will continue to monitor the situation closely and stand with those mourning in Iran and around the world. I've been to the port at Bandar Abbas, and we still don't know exactly the cause of the recent fire and explosion. And wow. And the USA and Iran are negotiating. And so, we know that there are forces that try to sabotage the negotiations. And there we go. So, and we know that it appears we're days, maybe even hours away from an end to the war in Ukraine. I mean, these are wild times. A lot is at stake in the international arena right now, no question about it. And these are certainly crazy times, no question about it. Wow. And then Leo Messi says, "How about Awake and Arise by Lal Tamar Rahman?" I don't know that song. I don't know if I can play that on here. But there you go. But yeah. So I guess there are a couple other things that are on my mind. I mean, I am very, very, very committed to making this event a success. So for those of you who don't know what we're doing, we have my book, Who Are the Houthis? What Are They Fighting For? We've printed 1,000 copies of this book, and we are distributing them all over the Chicago area with a poster for our convention on the back. We've met with all kinds of different people, and we have door knockers going on doors. And we are really, really focused on making our convention a success. And the fact that, that Trump is now talking about reopening peace talks with North Korea, the fact that there could very well be an end to the war in Ukraine soon, I'm really hoping that our convention in Chicago can be a victory rally to celebrate an end to the war in Ukraine. That through our activism and relentlessly raising the issue, we have brought this ugly war in Ukraine to an end. I really hope that can be the context that we meet in July. But the work that Center for Political Innovation does is really, really important. It's really, really important, and it's great. And but we need you involved. We need you to join CPI. We need you to come to our convention. We have so much that we need to do. We're building a real anti-imperialist movement. That is what we are doing. We are building a real anti-imperialist movement, and we need you to get involved. I've got a couple. I might want to show a video here. Why not, right? I might want to show something. Hold on. But yeah, if people have more super chats, more Rumble rants, that's fine. I can answer more questions. But yeah, we do a lot with CPI, and we're working hard to build successful events. I'm just looking through, seeing what we can show. Oh boy. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Well, this is a clip from a while back from a film a friend of ours made about the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the distortion of leftist politics. That might be a good one to put on. So let's put this on.
Starting in 1949, the CIA launched a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom and started funneling money to anti-communist leftists. Generally, the people that made up the Congress for Cultural Freedom were followers of the Trotskyite Max Shachtman. And Shachtman, after World War II, his followers, one of them being Irving Kristol, who is the father of neoconservatism, started working for the CIA. And Irving Kristol was actually the director of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program, where they started covertly giving money to leftists in order to put out an anti-Soviet message. And the magazine Partisan Review, which was purported to be a communist socialist magazine, and it was all over the college campuses. Every campus you went to, you could find Partisan Review, and it was this subversive communist magazine, except it like every issue was devoted to exposing the Stalinists. And a lot of the, what was done in Partisan Review magazine was equating the Soviets with the Nazis, right? And saying that it's basically the same system. And direct CIA payments to pay for their operations were supplemented by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller think tanks and other things. And various left-wing academics were getting subsidized by getting paid lots of money to have their articles appear in this magazine that was everywhere. And this was the conscious manipulation. And you talk about the Frankfurt School and the rise of this new, and it's weird because on the right, they have this whole thing about cultural Marxism. Right. Well, what they're missing is that a lot of these cultural critics that really emphasized Gramsci really downplayed the idea of class struggle. Emphasized. You had Herbert Marcuse, who said that the working class was not revolutionary; the intellectuals were the revolutionaries. All of this was being covertly supported as a way to kind of direct intellectuals and leftists away from Marxism. And in the process, they changed really the nature of what leftism was. The anti-populism came out. Susan Sontag is a really important voice in this milieu. And so Hannah Arendt also comes out of this. And anti-populism, the idea that average people are the enemy, that average people are dangerous, and if they ever get together and start fighting for their rights, that's basically the same as Nazi Germany. That became a big theme in what it meant to be a leftist, this kind of intellectual nonconformity.
Yeah, so that was a clip I did kind of explaining the Congress for Cultural Freedom. But I guess Gabby clarified her question. She was asking, what is the agenda behind degrowth? The agenda behind degrowth is trying to stabilize the system by destroying the means of production and to put the burden of the crisis onto us, to make us pay for the crisis that the rich created. And the degrowth crowd are very annoying. They're very, very annoying because it's really spiritual what they're saying when it really gets down to it, right? I had a debate with Jason Unruhe on this very point, and I showed him with quotes from Marx and all that the goal of socialism is to unleash the productive forces, to build a society with so much abundance. And he then immediately cut in, but it's like, but there has to be some limit there. I mean, it was like he didn't even really want to fight about that. And what the degrowth movement is really about is about pessimism. It's about we've gone too far. Human growth is bad. They're fighting for a mindset. They're fighting. It's a spiritual battle more than anything. They are committed to pessimism. And the degrowth people, they love to move the goalpost because they'll say things that are degrowth that are not degrowth. They'll say, well, there's nothing wrong with degrowth, Caleb. That just means working from home. No, working from home is not degrowth. If technology advances to the point that I can do a job that I used to go to the office to do, and I can do that from my home with technology, that's not degrowth, that's growth, right? And people say, well, degrowth just means saving electricity. Well, any employer is going to want to save electricity, right? That's not degrowth. But using less electricity generally, unless you're being wasteful, means producing less, having less of a productive output. And so if you're reducing the output, that's degrowth. But if you're just not turning off the lights when you're not using them, that's being smart. And any employer would do that. Like there are, they want to move the goalpost. And you have to wonder. And then their latest thing is they're now saying that they want abundance. Well, if you want abundance, you're not talking about degrowth. That's not degrowth then if there's abundance involved, but they just are so committed. We have to be committed to this concept of degrowth. No, if you're degrowing, you're dying, right? They have this thing that they say, endless growth. That's the ideology of a cancer cell. No, it's the ideology of a human being. It's the ideology of all life. If you stopped growing new cells, you would die, right? It's not the ideology of a cancer cell. It's the ideology of all cells. It's the ideology of all life. And, it's just this anti-human ideology. The idea humans are inherently bad, and the idea that human work, human creativity, human brilliance is something that needs to be squashed and suppressed, right? And that they are fighting for that mindset. They are just committed to this satanic way of thinking, this anti-human, pessimistic, hopeless way of thinking. And it's like, if you're producing more efficiently, but you're producing more, that's not degrowth. If you're, expanding technological capabilities, so you have to expend less energy and you get the same outcome, that's not degrowth, right? It's the degrowth agenda, it's largely they're trying to save capitalism. It's that they want to stay at the top. And so the game must be over. Growth must stop so they stay at the top forever, right? They're at the top of the world. And, but Russia is rising and China is rising and we are demanding more. And they say, no, the game must end. We must freeze the game so that we stay at the top forever. That's what's really behind degrowth. Growth must stop because if growth continues, they'll no longer be at the top of the pyramid. Other countries are rising, other people are rising, and they're saying, no, we just want to be at the top of the pyramid forever. So growth itself must end. And that's what they believe. And that we say the problem is that the system doesn't allow growth to continue, and that we want a rationally organized economy so growth is unlimited. And they say growth itself is the problem, that if we can stop growth, then we can have stability and we can stay at the top. That's basically what they're saying, right? That if they can stop growth, they can freeze things as they are. But if growth continues, it's going to lead to upheaval and they won't have their position at the top, basically. All right. On that note, I am going to end tonight's stream. It's been fun. I'll be back. This was a great stream tonight. It was weird. I just sat this afternoon. I had some free time. I just sat in a restaurant. And I thought, what am I going to talk about? I wrote down Ian Fleming, 1776, Hamilton, Spartacus, Conan the Barbarian, Boston Trap, Marilyn Ferguson versus Paula White Cain. That's what I wrote down on my list. And I think we had a great chat around all of those things tonight. We had a great conversation about all those things. So it worked out. I'll try to make another list some other time. So there you go. All right. Thanks, folks. Good night. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.